Good evening. So, before we begin, I do want to issue a warning with this presentation. So, to be short, we are going to be discussing human extinction, and in no uncertain terms. And so, while for many of you, I feel like some of this information might be just a little uncomfortable, for some of you it might just be outright distressing. And so, I don't want to take liberties with your mindset. If you feel like you suffer from anxiety issues or depression, and you want to excuse yourself from this theater during this presentation or at any point during it, please feel free to do so. I'm not going to draw attention to the fact that you're leaving or crack a joke at your expense or anything like that. Okay, I understand you. I wrote the fucking thing. So, without further ado, I'm going to assume that if you are still sitting here that I have your consent to get really fucking existential. I'm going to present the second law of thermodynamics and other civilization-ending cataclysms. My name is Mark. I work for a well-known scientific government agency, but I'm not here representing them, and I'm not sure how they would feel about me presenting some of this, so they're going to remain nameless. I'm here for myself only. These ideas are not mine, though. They are those of the scientific community at large. So let's begin. There are actually 4 laws of thermodynamics. They have a weird numbering system. It starts at 0 and goes to 3. Does anyone know why that is? They forgot about the first one. So it goes 1 to 3, and then a little while later, someone's like, oh shit, we forgot about temperature. Thermo is literally in the name. So they inserted that into the 0th position, and that's fine. But the one that we're going to be talking about is only the second law of thermodynamics. And there is a key concept to the second law that I doubt the majority of you know what it is. That's entropy. Just a quick show of hands. Who's heard of this word before, entropy? More than I thought, so that's great. Now, entropy is something that I don't think anyone actually understands. Eventually, you just define it and move on with your life. But there are a couple of ways that we can intuit through it, I think in a very helpful way. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on for at least the first part of this presentation. Energy spreads out. This is the first thing you have to know about entropy. Here's a familiar system, at least I hope it is. If you prepare a glass of piping hot water and you leave it on a table or a surface or in your freezer or outside, what happens to it? I actually want an answer to this. It cools down, right? So that's at least pretty clear. We set it down and we watch it, and over time it goes from really hot to really cold. But then there's this other law of thermodynamics that says you can't destroy energy, and if temperature is a form of energy, then what happened to it? And it turns out when I was trying to do this, I was like, okay, let's consider all of the variables, and I'm going to describe everything, and I ended up writing a 14-page essay. And so we're going to leave this alone, and we're going to move to something which is infinitely more simple. And that is 2 blocks. One of them is cold, one of them is hot. 10 points if you can guess which is which. Now we're going to bring these into thermal contact. The question is, what will happen to their temperature? Of course, we know that the cold one's going to heat up, and the hot one's going to cool down. But where does it stop? Again, I still think this is quite intuitive. Eventually, they're going to reach one temperature where you can't say that one is hotter than the other and the whole thing slows down. I hope you appreciate this, okay? But here's what you might not appreciate. Have you ever seen that go backwards? Have you ever seen a cold or lukewarm glass of water suddenly get hot and the environment that it's in cool down dramatically? I doubt that you have, or at least I hope that you haven't because you were hallucinating. It is impossible. That never ever happens. This is a one-way ticket. Now that is really fucking profound. Of all the laws in the universe, if you take all of Newton's laws of motion, for example, like the familiar parabolic trajectory, right, of a projectile. If someone was to show you a slideshow of that and ask you if it's playing forwards in time or backwards in time, you wouldn't actually know the answer because it looks exactly the same. The second law of thermodynamics is the only thing in the whole universe that gives time a direction. Without it, time would be utterly directionless. You'd be able to move about in the time dimension the same way that you move about in the spatial dimensions. So it is the reason why time marches forward. The other thing that I want you to appreciate about entropy is that chaos eventually works its way into everything. Consider these beautifully constructed towers. There is but one way that we can actually say that these towers are finished being built. Every piece has a place, and it forms this beautifully organized structure. But if you cause any disruption to that structure, the whole thing eventually comes toppling down. This is also very profound. And there's actually a statistical description for this that I think that you'll be able to appreciate, and that is that there is one way that this tower can be built, and an infinite number of ways that it can be unbuilt. Imagine all of the ways that you can distribute these pieces on the floor and not have a built tower. It's endless. But there's only one way that it can be built. So if you just wait long enough, eventually a tower, statistically speaking, has to fall. And just as we never saw that temperature equilibrium readjust to produce a hot block and a cold block, these towers will never reconstruct themselves, ever. And this is another facet to entropy. It always results in greater chaos, okay? And it never reverts. You actually struggle against this every day. Who at home has a pile of dishes in the sink that they're not too embarrassed to admit? Okay, what about a pile of clothes on the floor that they haven't put away? Okay, this is because there is one place for the clothes to be and an infinite number of places in the house where you can actually put them. Okay? And so just statistically, you have to keep pumping energy into the system in order to keep it organized. This is actually, I think, if I don't say so myself, a beautiful metaphor for the state of our universe. About 14 billion years ago, this thing started to fall over. And we are in that period where the blocks haven't yet perfectly distributed themselves on the floor. And we call this the window of opportunity sometimes. This is where things are still happening, where the last second is different to the next second. Now that actually begs a really important question. If this thing started to fall over 14 billion years ago, what was on the other side of that? And I don't blame you for asking it. The question is, what the fuck is that? We don't know, and maybe that's unsatisfying, but I do know something about it. I can describe some of its properties. One of them is that it was perfectly ordered. It was a point of zero entropy, but because the tower hadn't yet toppled, time was actually directionless at that state, which is why you'll sometimes hear physicists and philosophers say it doesn't even make sense to talk about a time before the universe because time hadn't started yet. We actually need the tower to be collapsing before time has a direction, so there is no time before that point. The problem is, this line is not infinite. If we let those two concepts, the fact that temperature is going to evenly distribute itself, and that ordered things eventually become perfectly chaotic, we will reach a point in about 10 to the 100 years, that's a 1 with 100 zeros after it, it's also called a googol, fun fact. But at that point, temperature is perfectly distributed throughout the entire universe. Everything that has order now doesn't, and the universe is basically a warm soup of no structure at all. We call that heat death. It's also called the cosmic time limit. And nothing, especially our species, will make it past that point. Time doesn't make it past that point, or at least time becomes meaningless after that stage. So just as before the universe, there was no time because nothing changes, at the end, at that point, there is also no time because everything is perfectly chaotic and nothing changes. We don't have to wait that long if we want our civilization to end, or if we're crossing our fingers that it's going to happen, because the sun is currently burning out. This is the sun now, and in about 5 billion years, it will deplete its hydrogen core. So right now, the sun is currently fusing hydrogen, and that's happening mostly at its center. And as it does that, it forms helium, which is slightly more dense. And so the core is constantly filling up with helium, and not as much fusion is happening. That number is when that last hydrogen atom is finally fused, and we begin what's called shell burning. And shell burning has the interesting after effect is that it causes the sun to swell out and also cool down a little bit, or at least its surface cools down a little bit. When it's that size, the very edge of it is about equal to Earth's orbit. So if we make it that far, the Earth will be engulfed in hot plasma. I don't think, all of the earthquake proofing and stuff that we do right now is going to withstand a giant ball of cosmic plasma scorching the surface of the planet. We just don't make it. Now, 5 billion years is still pretty far away, right? You might think, what about all of the stuff we can do between now and 5 billion years from now? Well, we don't have to wait that long either. The sun is actually getting brighter every day. Not necessarily hotter, but brighter. They're kind of related, but kind of not. You can argue with me on the details later. But in about 1 billion years, it will be so bright, and that's increasing at about 5% every 100,000 years, I think, that we will no longer be able to retain the oceans on our planet. And so at that number of years from now, the oceans will have completely evaporated, and all life, at least on the surface of the planet, will have disappeared. There is actually some bacteria and archaea, which is kind of like bacteria, but not. And it lives deep in the Earth's crust, and sometimes even in the mantle, apparently. I don't know, that's a bit contentious for me at least. But they're chemotrophs, and they don't rely on the sun or the oceans to survive, and it's possible that they will withstand this event. But certainly nothing that you would call civilization will. I still think 1 billion years is too far away. Is anyone starting to feel weird? Because we don't have to wait that long. Earth is getting warmer. Is this news to anyone? Global warming is kind of here, and it's real. I don't care what you read on Wikipedia or anywhere else. That's not a jab at Wikipedia, by the way. It actually says global warming is real. But there's a really strange thing that's happening. And that is that there's been this long-standing assumption that even if it wipes us out, other organisms might survive it. That's already pretty bleak, but there is an adaptability limit to what we call heat stress. There is something called the physiological wet bulb condition, and this is how you measure heat stress in animals. You basically put them in a box, and you pump up the humidity to a certain level, you raise the temperature to a certain level, and at those conditions, it is now unable to exchange heat with its environment. Do you remember this picture? Had it just a few slides ago. When the Earth is the same temperature that you are, you can no longer lose body temperature by sweating. And nothing survives this. It turns out the heat stress condition for every animal that we've experimented on has the same threshold, and we're going to get there in about 300 to 500 years, given the current rate of CO2 emission. Now you might want to think, oh, but think of all the nice things that are happening. Does anyone know what Teen Trees was? Who contributed to Teen Trees? No one? Interesting. So this was an internet phenomenon, end of last year, and the goal was to plant 20 million trees, I think in like a 4-month period. They actually did it, okay? People contributed, huge community involvement, really positive, I think, or at least the heart is in the right place. Does anyone hazard a guess in hours how much it achieved for reducing CO2 emissions? 6. 20 million trees allowed to survive for 35 years will offset 6 hours of global CO2. Actually, I think that might just be the United States. Let's say it's global. There is no reason to expect that anything being done now or planned in the future will do anything to slow this down. We are absolutely headed towards this extinction event, and it affects not just our civilization, but anything that needs to regulate its body temperature. So that includes plants and animals as well. We don't have to wait that long. Infections are almost incurable. You guys aware of this? A little bit? Who's heard of superbugs? They're here. This I've stolen from Howie's lab, and basically he got sick, probably strep throat. He swabbed the back of his mouth and he put it underneath a microscope slide. And these jellyfish things that you can see swimming around on those microscope plates are probably streptococcus. I'm actually not entirely sure what it is. But those microorganisms now are effectively immune to any drug that we've ever developed. Don't answer this, by the way, because it's a massive invasion of privacy, so just think it to yourself quietly. Who's on antibiotics right now? Who's been on antibiotics recently? Would it disturb you to know that there's no better than a coin flip chance already that those antibiotics will do absolutely nothing against the thing that you're infected with? This has been a bona fide phenomenon, recognizable in the scientific community since at least the early 90s, probably a bit before then, but I'd say this was the cusp. This is when everyone recognized that yes, this is coming, we've got to do something about it now because it's really, really devastating. And before then, people were like, yeah, maybe it's not going to be so bad. There's another problem, and that is that as the global temperature increases, the spread of antibiotic-resistant traits is accelerating. So not only are we not doing anything to alleviate the antimicrobial resistance crisis, it seems that we're doing everything we can to exacerbate it. After that, we learned that antibiotic resistance is actually ancient. It's long been thought that antibiotic resistance is something that humans created, right? We invented all these drugs, we spread them throughout the environment, we force-fed them to ourselves, and eventually antibiotic resistance increased, but no. It turns out that all of the drugs that we developed were actually based on natural analogs, and so there was already a very large reservoir of resistance in nature. All we've done is select for it and amplify it hugely, to the point where the things that are susceptible to antibiotics basically can't be found anymore. Or at least within a decade, I doubt that we'll find any at all. The Infectious Diseases Society of America has basically been pulling their hair out about this for the last, let's say, 15 years. And this is one of my favorite essays of theirs because it has this section in it that is just really depressing. Oops. So the abstract basically says that we have lobbied Congress now 6 times with really well thought out policy, and it has largely been ignored. And it remains unclear as to whether or not at any point in the future any legislative stops are going to be put in place. And more to the point, the public doesn't even seem to know what's happening. That is devastating, right? Maybe you didn't know about the heat death of the universe. Maybe you didn't know about the sun swelling into a red giant and engulfing our planet. Maybe you didn't appreciate the global warming end of our civilization is only 300 years away. But I would hope that you would know that the antibiotic resistance end of our civilization was 20 years ago. And that is really terrifying. I was recently at a meeting where we were starting to talk about, in very serious terms, how to address this problem. One of the things that surfaced was that saving human lives via antibiotics research is extremely not profitable, or at least investors aren't really attracted to it. Would you like to hazard a guess? Let's choose a bug that you all know. Who's heard of Mesa? Golden staph, right? Can I get a few hands? Good. Golden staph, it kills anybody. It's indiscriminate. It's amazing how equalizing things like golden staph are. Let's say that you developed a drug for it right now in this room and it works, right? You're going to sell it. Would you be upset if I told you you're going to sell it for negative $100 million? Because that's the current market rate. Now you know, okay? I don't want to end on such a bad note. You might question, and I think very reasonably, why would I come here and ruin everyone's whole fucking week? The thing is, I don't think that not knowing is ever advantageous. I would prefer that you know things so that when you come to make complex decisions, you have the best possible starting point to make those decisions. Who feels maybe a little bit more now than they did at the beginning of this presentation that existence is absurd? It's okay, right? Welcome to existentialism. I'm happy to show you around. But I do want to draw attention. I want to leave you with a parting piece of advice, okay? And that is, can you just appreciate how cute this dog is? Isn't it cute? Don't dwell on anything that I've told you tonight. Be aware of it, but don't let it eat into your psyche. Because no matter how bad the future gets, and maybe it's pretty bad, but this dog is really cute right now. Okay? And so if you take anything away from my presentation, let it be that. Thank you so much.
Questions, I've got a question for you. Given that you do lots of work in this area, what gets you out of bed every day?
Coffee.
Good coffee?
Good coffee. Rick and Morty. I live for the little things. I try not to let cosmic terror dictate what I do with my life. And I also don't let, let's say, fantasies of legacy or lineage control any of my decision making. So if I'm getting up just to see the next Spider-Man movie, that's good enough for me.
Okay, look out for the Spider-Man movies and the cute puppies in your life. We'll take a few questions from the audience. Yeah.
If you got an infection, would you take antibiotics?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so a coin flip chance is still better than 0.
Take another question, yeah? Your views on humans leaving planet Earth and going to somewhere else.
It's a really excellent and considered question. So there is a, let's say a commonly held belief that Elon Musk and SpaceX, for example, are going to move us, our whole civilization, off planet Earth and onto Mars, which maybe you'll escape the red giant version of our sun, but then you have to move somewhere else after that unless you create a stellar engine. There's absolutely no way we're getting that far. But the question is, how do I feel about it? I feel that billions of years of evolution has selected you to live right here. If you take a freshwater fish out of a pond and throw it in the ocean, would you be surprised if it died? Probably not. So if you take a human off of planet Earth at 1G and put it onto Mars at 6G, or sorry, 0.6G, whatever the number is, would you be surprised if it developed all sorts of blood pressure issues? Would it also surprise you to learn that if you're in outer space, and astronauts report this all the time, if you close your eyes, you see bright flecks of light constantly. And that is because you're constantly being bombarded with cosmic radiation, and it's lighting up the neuron at the back of your eye. And it's very unlikely that if we were to spend a really significant amount of time in space, for example, the amount of time it would take to get from Earth to another Earth-like planet somewhere else in the galaxy, that you would survive the radiation exposure alone.
Have you thought about how he feels about moving to Mars? Wade?
Are there any Earth-ending, life-ending cataclysms that you didn't include in the top?
What other doom and gloom can you add to the list? Because Wade wants more.
The question is, are there any cataclysms, Earth-ending or civilization-ending, that I haven't included? More than you want to know. So many.
Thanks for that
Actually,
question.
one of the interesting ones has to do with the antibiotics crisis, and that is that I'm not sure that we any longer have any control in our financial systems. And I think that it is creating, so that what everyone's already observed, right, which is this growing wealth gap everywhere in the world, right, not just in developed nations, but everywhere. I think that what that's doing is accruing resources in one particular area, and the people that control those resources won't act in favor of civilization like they did, for example, if you look at like the Rockefeller family and that kind of stuff in the early 1900s and up to 1950s. But because that pattern has broken and all the wealth is accruing in one area, the machine that used to use that wealth as fuel to kind of keep civilization moving hasn't really done anything in a really long period of time. So one of the cataclysms that I don't even know how to begin talking about because it's so complicated that I wouldn't even know where to start is actually just the global finance sector.
We'll save that for another talk. We'll take another question. Yep.
What should we do?
What should we do? What's the answer? You've given all this doom and gloom, set us hope.
Yeah. sick. Yeah, well, okay, well, what can you do? So it was interesting actually, because I think I had a relatively fortuitous segue into this talk because we had this wonderful video presentation. And if I could second anything that was said in that, it was, you have to do it yourself. If you really want to cut down on CO2 emissions, it's not about electing a leader to do it, or waiting for someone to invent a machine that's going to soak up all the CO2, or a time machine that's going to transport the climate back to the pre-industrial era, right? None of that is going to happen. If you really want to do something about your carbon footprint, I can show you lots of websites that will show you exactly how to do that. But the question is, and this is the really big problem with this answer, is how do you force everyone to do it? Because even that think globally, act locally mentality has had a really long time to prove its worth. And what has it achieved? So the short answer is, I don't know. We need lots of really innovative solutions to these kinds of problems. And I have perused a lot of what's currently on offer, and I'm not satisfied with any of them.
No answer to your question. We'll take one more, but power to the grassroots. We'll take one more question. Or not. I promise I won't make fun of your question. Yeah.
If you really believe antibiotics are going to be the end of the world, should we bother doing anything about climate change?
Why care about climate change if we're all gonna die?
Remember, one of the accelerating factors surrounding the antibiotics crisis is actually climate change itself. So if you could buy yourself another few decades, for example, to sort out the finances in this sector, I think that would be extremely useful. So let's put a value on a decade, right, in terms of culture and financial change. Who in this room remembers LimeWire, Kazaa, Napster? Do you remember the MP3 was going to be just the end of everything, right? Universal Studios and Sony are throwing in the towel because the MP3 has devastated the music industry, and now the MP3 is the most profitable music technology that has ever existed. You can turn poorly performing financial products around if you learn how to manipulate the finances to make it work. So I do think that there is sort of a string of relative priority. At the moment, I refuse to accept that when a child gets a skinned knee, that we should just accept that they're probably going to die of that. Or when someone gets a paper cut at work, that they should probably just die of that, right? I would rather address that first than the physiological heat bulb phenomenon that's coming for us in 500 years. Because if we can overcome at least that part, then maybe we can get everyone on the same page and address the next part, and then the part after that, and the part after that.
Put a whole new meaning to death by paper cuts. Let's put our hands together. Thank you so much, Mark.